The year is 1483. Inside the formidable Tower of London, two young boys, a 12-year-old king and his 9-year-old brother, were placed under the care of their uncle. They were brought to this fortress for their protection. But the boys' laughter soon fell silent. The door to their chamber was locked and they were never seen again, vanishing completely from the pages of history. The stage for this mystery was set by the Wars of the Roses, a bloody family feud for the English throne. When their father, King Edward IV, died suddenly, their uncle Richard was named Lord Protector. With an efficiency any modern CEO would admire, Richard swiftly declared the boys illegitimate and seized the throne for himself, becoming King Richard III. He remains history's prime suspect, but was he the only one? What about his successor, Henry Tudor, who had every reason to eliminate rival claimants to secure his own crown? It's a 500-year-old cold case where the evidence is thin and motives are thick, a stark reminder that history is often just a story of a very, very dysfunctional family. If you're tired of videos about a bloated, rotting King Henry VIII and his seemingly endless quest for a male heir and a new wife, not necessarily in that order, then you've come to the right place. Because before the Tudors turned English history into a primetime soap opera, there was a family drama that was far messier, far more brutal, and frankly, far more interesting. A story not just of beheadings, but of a kingdom so fundamentally broken that it spent 30 years tearing itself apart. Welcome to the Wars of the Roses. Now, calling it the Wars of the Roses makes it sound almost poetic, doesn't it? Like a particularly aggressive gardening competition. But in reality, it was less about horticulture and more about a 30-year family reunion from hell where everyone was named either Edward or Henry. And instead of arguing about politics over dinner, they settled their differences with long bows and broadswords on a muddy field. This was the ultimate dynastic grudge match between two branches of the same royal family, the Plantagenets, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white. For decades, they had bled England dry in a chaotic struggle for the throne. It was a brutal, honorless conflict where alliances shifted like sand kings were captured and recaptured, and the nobility of England was systematically exterminated. By 1471, however, a victor had finally decisively emerged. A man who seemed to embody everything a medieval king should be. This was King Edward IV of the House of York. Picture him standing at over 6'4". He was a giant in an age of smaller men. He was handsome, charismatic, a brilliant military commander, and possessed a personal charm that could win over a hostile crowd in minutes. After years of bloody turmoil under the famously unstable Lancastrian King Henry VI. Edward IV was a breath of fresh, competent air. He crushed his enemies at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, effectively wiping out the direct Lancastrian line of succession. He stabilized the economy, reformed the law, and for the first time in a generation, England enjoyed a period of relative peace and prosperity. It seemed the Wars of the Roses were finally over. The White Rose of York had won. Edward had it all: a secure throne, a growing economy, and two healthy sons to succeed him, our boys, young Edward and Richard. He even had a loyal, devoted, and highly competent younger brother who had fought by his side through thick and thin. That brother was Richard, Duke of Gloucester. For over a decade, Richard had been Edward's right-hand man, while Edward ruled from London, enjoying the pleasures of kingship, and he enjoyed them a lot. Richard was entrusted with governing the notoriously rebellious north of England. He was known as a pious man, a stern but fair administrator, and a soldier of unquestionable loyalty to his brother. He was the dependable, serious-minded foil to Edward's charismatic, pleasure-loving king. The perfect partnership. So with a strong king, two male heirs, and a loyal brother, the future of the House of York looked rock solid. What could possibly go wrong? Well, allow me to introduce the single greatest political miscalculation of Edward IV's reign. Allow me to introduce the Queen. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville, and she was, by all accounts, stunningly beautiful. She was also a widow 5 years older than the king, with 2 sons from her previous marriage. Crucially, her family, the Woodvilles, were minor gentry. They were respectable enough, but in the viciously snobbish world of the English aristocracy, they were complete nobodies. To make matters worse, they had originally been Lancastrian supporters. Her first husband had died fighting against the House of York, and in 1464, King Edward IV, the most powerful man in England, the most eligible bachelor in Europe, secretly married her. When the news broke, the court was beyond scandalized. They were apoplectic. The king's chief advisor, the powerful Earl of Warwick, a man so influential he was known as the Kingmaker, had been in France actively negotiating a politically crucial marriage for Edward with a French princess. Edward's secret marriage not only humiliated Warwick, it threw a wrench into the entire foreign policy of the kingdom. It was seen as a catastrophic lapse in judgment, a king choosing personal desire over political duty. But the real problem wasn't just the marriage itself, it was what came after. The Woodvilles. Once their sister was queen, the Woodville family descended upon the court like a flock of ravenous seagulls at a seaside fish and chip stand. Suddenly, this family of provincial nobodies was the most powerful and influential clan in the country, and they weren't shy about it. Queen Elizabeth orchestrated a breathtaking series of strategic marriages for her 5 brothers, 7 sisters, and 2 sons from her first marriage. They were married off to the wealthiest and most powerful heirs and heiresses in the land, snatching up titles, lands, and fortunes that the established nobility had been eyeing for generations. Her father, Richard Woodville, was made Earl Rivers and Treasurer of England. Her brother, Anthony Woodville, became a leading figure at court. Her son, from her first marriage, Thomas Grey, was made Marquis of Dorset. They created a power block that was entirely dependent on their connection to the Queen, and they were universally despised for it. They were seen as greedy, arrogant upstarts who had bewitched the king and were sucking the kingdom dry. This created a deep and bitter resentment that split the Yorkist court right down the middle. On one side, you had the new money of the Queen's family, the Woodvilles. On the other, you had the old guard, the men who had fought and bled with Edward to win him the throne. The most prominent members of this old guard were William Lord Hastings, the king's closest friend, and Lord Chamberlain, and the king's own brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Hastings and Richard hated the Woodvilles, particularly the Queen's brother Anthony and her son, Thomas Grey. They saw them as a cancerous influence rivals for the king's favor and a threat to their own power. For years, Edward IV, through sheer force of personality, managed to keep a lid on this simmering cauldron of hatred. He balanced the factions, played them off against each other, and kept his court from imploding. He was the keystone holding the entire unstable arch together. And then on April 9th, 1483, the keystone was suddenly unexpectedly removed. At the age of just 40, King Edward IV, the picture of health and vitality, fell gravely ill. Some said it was pneumonia. Some said typhoid. Others whispered it was simply the result of a lifestyle of extreme excess. Whatever the cause, within a few short days, the great king was dead. And with his last breath, the carefully managed peace of his kingdom died with him. The moment the news broke, the kingdom held its breath. The new king, Edward V, was a boy of 12. In medieval law, a king was a king regardless of age, but in practice, a child could not rule. The kingdom required a regent, a protector, to govern in his name until he came of age. And here the fatal crack in the House of York split wide open. There were 2 clear factions, each with a claim to control the new king, and therefore the country. Faction Jura 1.
The Woodvilles. The Queen Elizabeth Woodville naturally wanted to maintain her family's grip on power. Her brother, the accomplished and ambitious Anthony Woodville Earl Rivers, was the young king's governor. At the time of the king's death, young Edward V was with his uncle Anthony at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border. The Woodville plan was simple: get the boy to London as quickly as possible, crown him immediately, and establish a regency council that they, of course, would dominate. In their minds, who better to guide the young king than his own mother's family faction?
The Old Guard. This faction believed that, by right tradition and competence, the only man fit to be regent was the king's only surviving brother, the most powerful nobleman in the realm, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was up in the north of England when he heard the news. He argued that the king's coronation should be delayed and that he, as the boy's uncle and the designated Lord Protector in Edward IV's will, should be the one to escort the king to London and oversee the government. In the middle of this was Lord Hastings, the late king's best friend. Hastings in London despised the Woodvilles and saw their plan for a quick coronation as a power grab that would sideline him and the rest of the old nobility. He saw Richard as the only man who could counter their influence. He made a fateful decision. He secretly sent a message to Richard in the north, warning him of the Woodville's plans and urging him to intercept the young king before he reached London. So the stage was set for a collision. On one road heading south towards London was the young king, Edward IV, surrounded by his Woodville uncle and his entourage racing to secure their power. On another road, also heading south, was his other uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, riding with a force of his own loyal men determined to assert his authority as Lord Protector. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a zero-sum game. Whichever faction got their hands on the boy king would control the kingdom. The other would be left out in the cold or more likely find themselves facing charges of treason. The collision happened on April 30th, 1483, at a small town called Stony Stratford. Richard, acting with the decisiveness of a military commander, got there first. He met his nephew, the young king, and with all outward signs of respect and loyalty, he arrested the boy's uncle, Anthony Woodville, and the other Woodville companions. Richard announced that he had uncovered a Woodville plot to sideline him and seize control of the government, and that he was merely acting to protect his nephew and the stability of the realm. He then took possession of the young king himself. Back in London, when the news arrived, chaos erupted. Queen Elizabeth Woodville, hearing that her brother had been arrested and her son was now in Richard's custody, knew exactly what this meant. She panicked. Gathering her younger children, including the 9-year-old Prince Richard, she fled in the middle of the night to the one place her enemies couldn't touch her, the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey. Richard, now in control of the new king, proceeded to London. He assured the royal council, with Lord Hastings' vocal support, that his intentions were honorable. He was merely fulfilling his duty as Lord Protector, as his brother had wished. He would oversee his nephew's coronation and guide him until he was old enough to rule. And so, for his safety and to prepare for his coronation, the young King Edward V was lodged in the traditional residence for monarchs awaiting their crowning, the royal apartments within the Tower of London. To the public, it looked like a crisis had been averted. The evil Woodvilles had been thwarted, and the kingdom was in the steady, loyal hands of the Lord Protector. But behind the scenes, the story was far from over. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and the most notorious mystery in English history was about to begin. The first prince was in the Tower. Now Richard just needed to get his hands on the second. So our story stands at a precarious balance. In one corner we have the new uncrowned King Edward V, securely lodged in the Tower of London under the watchful eye of his uncle, the Lord Protector Richard, Duke of Gloucester. In the other corner, just a mile or so away, we have his mother, the Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville, huddled in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey with her daughters and her younger son, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. For a few weeks in May of 1483, London existed in this state of tense equilibrium. On the surface, things proceeded as planned. Richard, as Lord Protector, governed the country. He had the full support of the royal council and the powerful lords like Hastings and Buckingham. Preparations for the young king's coronation, initially set for early May, were simply rescheduled for late June. To the average Londoner, it looked as though a political crisis had been expertly managed by a firm, loyal hand. The ship of state had been steadied, but Richard knew this was an illusion. The situation was untenable. As long as the Woodville Queen remained in sanctuary with the second prince, she was a living, breathing symbol of opposition. She was a rallying point for anyone who distrusted him. More importantly, the spare heir was not secure. In the deadly chess game of medieval politics, having only one of your opponent's key pieces locked down isn't a checkmate. It's just a temporary advantage. He needed both boys. So Richard began a campaign of persuasion. It was a masterclass in political pressure, blending public reason with private threat. He sent the Archbishop of Canterbury, a man of immense religious authority, to the gates of the sanctuary to negotiate with the Queen. Imagine the scene: a desperate, terrified mother facing one of the most powerful men of God in the kingdom. The Archbishop's argument presented on behalf of Richard and the council was painfully reasonable. He argued that it was unfitting for the young prince to be cooped up in a gloomy sanctuary while his brother, the king, lived in the royal apartments in the Tower. It sent a terrible message of disunity. The king, he said, was lonely and needed his brother's companionship. It was his duty as a prince of the realm to be with his king. When Elizabeth resisted, the tone surely shifted. The Archbishop would have sworn on every holy relic he could find that the boy would be safe. Richard, he insisted, was his sworn protector. To refuse was to publicly declare that she did not trust the Lord Protector and the entire royal council, an act bordering on treason. The veiled threat was clear. Give us the boy or we will take him, and in doing so, we will brand you an enemy of the state. Cornered with no allies left on the council and facing immense pressure, Elizabeth Woodville made the decision that would seal her children's fate. She relented. Eyewitness accounts describe a heartbreaking scene as the Queen brought her younger son out, giving a tearful speech about his innocence and her trust in Richard's honor. Little Richard of Shrewsbury, reportedly weeping at having to leave his mother, was taken by the hand by the Archbishop and led away. He was brought directly to the Tower of London to join his brother. The trap was now fully sprung. Richard had them. Both the heir and the spare locked away in the most secure fortress in England, a palace that was also conveniently the state's most notorious prison. With the boys out of sight, they were quickly out of the public mind. For a few weeks, the brothers were occasionally seen playing in the Tower gardens, their presence a seeming reassurance that all was well. And then Richard made his move. It was a stunning, audacious pivot that must have given the entire political establishment whiplash. The pretense of the loyal protector was dropped and the ambition of the claimant to the throne was revealed in full shocking color. The operation was executed with the brutal precision of a military campaign. The first step was to eliminate any potential opposition on his own council. On June 13th, during a council meeting at the Tower, Richard suddenly accused Lord Hastings, the very man who had helped him gain power, the late king's closest friend, of treason, claiming Hastings was conspiring with the Woodvilles to assassinate him. Witnesses said Hastings was given no trial, not even time to see a priest. He was dragged out to the Tower Green and beheaded on a random log of wood. The message was brutally clear: if the Lord Protector could execute the most powerful man on the council without due process, no one was safe. Dissent would not be tolerated. The second step was a public relations campaign designed to destroy the legitimacy of the two boys he held captive. On Sunday, June 22nd, a prominent theologian named Dr. Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon at St. Paul's Cross London's public pulpit. What he said was pure political dynamite. He claimed that a pre-contract of marriage had existed between the late King Edward IV and another woman, a Lady Eleanor Butler, before he married Elizabeth Woodville. Now, in the canon law of the 15th century, a pre-contract was as binding as a marriage itself. If this were true, it meant Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid. And if the marriage was invalid, all of their children were bastards. And if they were bastards, they had no claim to the throne whatsoever. It was an incredible claim. A convenient detail that no one had thought to mention during the entire 20-year reign of Edward IV, but which now suddenly became the most important fact in the kingdom. The public was stunned. The final step was to make it official. A few days later, a formal petition was presented to Richard by a delegation representing the three estates of the realm, the lords, the commons, and the clergy, though it was largely engineered by Richard's ally, the Duke of Buckingham. This document, known as the Titulus Regius, laid out the whole argument in legal terms. It repeated the story of the pre-contract declared Edward IV's children illegitimate and stated that since Richard was the only true legitimate heir of the House of York, it was his patriotic duty to take the crown himself to save the kingdom from the chaos of a bastard succession. It was a masterstroke of political theater. Richard wasn't seizing the throne. He was reluctantly accepting it at the desperate request of the nation. It was a burden, a duty, a noble sacrifice he was making for the good of all. Richard naturally accepted this heavy burden. On June 26, 1483, he appeared at Westminster Hall and sat upon the marble King's Bench, the symbolic act of taking the throne. The boys in the Tower were no longer King Edward V and Prince Richard. They were now simply Edward and Richard, the bastard sons of the late king. Their titles, their inheritance, and their future had been erased in a matter of days. The last recorded sighting of the two boys was around this time, seen playing in the Tower gardens, sometimes shooting arrows. Then they were seen less and less frequently. Then not at all. The last glimmers of their existence faded into rumor and then into complete silence. The door to their chamber in the Tower was now permanently locked from the outside. On July 6th, less than 3 months after his brother's death, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The loyal protector was gone. The king was here, but his crown, he would soon discover, was a heavy one. It was haunted by the whispers that echoed from the silent, cursed chamber within the Tower. What had happened to the boys, and as long as they were presumed to be alive, they remained a potent symbol for any rebellion against him. A king cannot rule in peace while the specter of a more legitimate claimant hangs over his head. The problem of the princes had not been solved. It had merely entered its final, terrifying phase. All right, the story of what happened is over. Now we get to the good part. The part where we stop being historians for a moment and become what we all secretly love to be, armchair detectives. Welcome back to Cursed Chambers and our special investigative segment, Historical Cold Case. Our crime scene, the Tower of London, a grim multi-purpose medieval fortress. Our victims, two boys, Edward and Richard, last seen sometime in the summer of 1483. The case has been cold for over 500 years. The witnesses are all long dead, and the original case files were likely burned, buried, or rewritten by the winners. But that's never stopped us before, has it? Let's open the files on our 3 prime suspects. Suspect
Richard III, the King. Let's be honest, if this were a modern police procedural, the show would be over in 15 minutes. Richard III is the husband who takes out a massive life insurance policy on his wife the day before she has a tragic accident. The evidence against him isn't just a smoking gun, it's a smoking cannon still hot from the battlefield. The most obvious motive in the history of motives. He wanted the crown. The boys were the only 2 people standing in his way. Once he declared them bastards, their very existence was a threat. Any rebellion against him would rally around the true kings in the tower. For Richard, eliminating them wasn't just ambition. It was political pest control, absolute and total. He was the king. He controlled the Tower of London. He controlled the guards, the locks, and the flow of information. No one went in or out of that chamber without his knowledge or his command. He had the keys to the entire building, both literally and figuratively. The case against Richard was built almost immediately after his death. The Tudor historians writing for the man who defeated him painted him as a monstrous villain. Sir Thomas More's account, written years later but based on sources from the time, gives a detailed story of Richard hiring a down-on-his-luck gentleman named Sir James Tyrrell to commit the murders. Tyrrell, in turn, supposedly had his grooms smother the boys with their pillows. It's a neat, tidy story. Perhaps a little too neat. While it's certainly Tudor propaganda designed to legitimize the new regime, propaganda is often most effective when it's built around a kernel of truth that people already suspect. Suspect.
Henry Tudor, the successor. Every good mystery needs a twist, a but what if theory. Suspect who seems to come out of nowhere. Enter Henry Tudor, the man who would eventually defeat Richard at the Battle of Bosworth and become King Henry VII, almost as strong as Richard's. After he took the throne, any living Yorkist claimant was a massive threat to his own shaky grasp on power. If the princes were still alive somewhere, they were the focal point for any rebellion. Killing them would have been a cold, ruthless, but politically pragmatic move to secure his new dynasty. He was certainly capable of it. Henry VII was not a sentimental man. This is where it gets tricky. At the time the boys vanished in the summer of 1483, Henry was in exile in France. He had no access to the tower. However, the theory goes that the boys weren't killed until after Henry took the throne in 1485. The biggest piece of evidence for this is Henry's own strange silence. If you had just defeated a supposed child-murdering tyrant, wouldn't the first thing you do be to storm the tower, find the bodies, and parade them through the streets of London to prove to the world what a monster your predecessor was? Henry never did. He never launched an official investigation. He never produced the bodies. He just passed an act in Parliament that formally condemned Richard for his unnatural, mischievous, and great perjuries, treasons, homicides, and murders in shedding of infants' blood, without providing any actual proof. It's the historical equivalent of saying, he definitely did it just. Trust me on this. Suspect.
Suspect 3. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham. And now for our wild card. The best friend, the right-hand man, the ally, who suddenly turns. Buckingham was Richard's #1 supporter in his bid for the throne. He was the one who engineered the public petition, asking Richard to become king. Then, just 3 months into Richard's reign, he launched a massive, ill-fated rebellion against him. Why the sudden change of heart? This is pure speculation. Buckingham had a distant but legitimate claim to the throne himself. Perhaps he killed the boys on his own initiative, hoping to frame Richard. With the kingdom in chaos over the murder of 2 children, maybe he thought he could swoop in and take the crown for himself. As Richard's closest ally, he had significant access and influence at the Tower. His betrayal of Richard was so sudden and violent that it suggests something profound had broken between them. Did he try to blackmail the king over the murders, or did he commit the act and was then horrified by what he had done, leading to a rebellion born of guilt? We'll never know. His rebellion failed, and Richard had him executed for treason before he could tell his side of the story. Finally, there's the physical evidence, or the lack of it. In 1674, during renovations at the tower, workers discovered a wooden chest buried under a staircase. Inside were the skeletons of two small children. Convinced they were the lost princes, King Charles II had them interred with royal honors in Westminster Abbey. In 1933, the remains were exhumed and examined. The report concluded they were of the right age, but forensic science at the time was limited. Today we have DNA testing that could likely provide a definitive answer. But the royal family, citing respect for the sanctity of the tomb, has consistently refused all requests for a new examination. And so, the trail goes cold. We are left with a 500-year-old mystery, a locked room with 3 powerful suspects, and a royal family that prefers to let sleeping bones lie. The evidence points overwhelmingly in one direction, but without a body, without a confession, without that final definitive proof, we are left in the shadow of doubt, a place Richard III's defenders have happily occupied for centuries. So after sifting through 500 years of propaganda theories and suspicious silence, where does that leave us? We have a primary suspect in Richard III, a man with the motive, means, and opportunity so perfect it feels like it was written for the stage, which of course it was. We have a plausible if less likely culprit in Henry Tudor, the man who benefited most from the crime in the long run. And we have a wild card in the Duke of Buckingham, the ambitious friend whose betrayal remains a tantalizing what if. But the hard truth is, the trail has gone cold forever. The smoking gun is lost to time, and the definitive evidence we crave, the DNA that could give those small bones a name, remains locked away, deemed less important than royal tradition. The case of the princes in the tower is destined to remain what it has always been, the greatest murder mystery in English history. And perhaps that is the true curse of this chamber. It's not a ghost story, but a story of ambiguity. The curse is the void, the unanswered question that has echoed through the centuries, allowing us to project our own ideas of villainy and innocence onto the characters. Richard III can be either a monstrous tyrant or a maligned, misunderstood hero, depending on which historian you read or which society you join. Ultimately, the tragedy of Edward and Richard is more than just a cold case. It's a brutal lesson in the nature of power. It shows how swiftly legitimacy can be erased, how easily children can become pawns in a dynastic game, and how history is not a clear, clean narrative, but a messy, bloody, and often deeply unsatisfying story written by the victors. It reminds us that behind all the crowns, the pageantry, and the grand titles, these were just people. A family so consumed by ambition and paranoia that it ended up devouring its own young. So who was the true villain, the man who gave the order or the system of ruthless ambition that made such an order not only possible, but logical? That is the question that still haunts the Tower of London. What do you think? Let us know in the comments who you believe was responsible for the fate of the princes. And if you wish to unlock more of history's cursed chambers, subscribe to our channel. The past is waiting.